bold, inclusive, and growth oriented. That was the message Budget 2021 clearly gave. India has got most of its big bang reforms when it has had its back against the wall. Be it the balance of payment crisis, which led to liberalization, the coal and 2G scam, which led to clear auctioning process, or the weaker asset quality of banks, which led to the formulation of the IBC code. COVID, in no doubt, has been a crisis like never before, and we are seeing some green shoots emerge as far as the reforms in India are concerned. This budget has been appreciated by India Inc., investors, and every citizen alike. But the key definitely lies in execution like never before. To discuss on what this budget means for an investor and a layman, we have with us a subject matter expert, Mr. Vetri Subramaniam. He is the group president and head of equities at UTI Mutual Fund, an IIM Bangalore alumnus. He has over 25 years of rich experience across entities like Kotak Mahindra Mutual Fund, Invesco, and a little lesser known fact about him is that he is also the co founder of Sharekhan. Thank you, sir, for joining us at such a short notice. We truly appreciate your time.
Thank you, Megha. Glad to be here on your show.
So, sir, let me begin by asking you that B definitely stands for boldness as far as this budget is concerned. Now, if we see 2021, it has been a spectacular return in terms of market movements. From the lows in March, we are at lifetime highs as we speak. Six trading sessions before the budget, we saw some kind of correction, and we have seen all the losses being recouped in the next three trading sessions. If I look at FI inflows in the last three trading sessions, it has been to the tune of $1.1 billion. Now, I wanted to understand from you whether it is a hope rally or a relief rally, and how would you rate this budget overall on a scale of 1 to 10?
That's a lot of questions packed in there. But first, let me tell you what it is that I won't be able to answer. I've spent almost now close to 30 years in the markets. It will be soon. And trying to interpret what the market does in any given 3 days or 2 days is a futile exercise. The market doesn't tell us why it went up or why it went down. Everything that we say about why the market went up or down really reflects our own individual perspective. It's not really necessarily why the market did what it did. So I won't get into too much about that 4 day down, 2 day up. I mean, a lot of the activity in the market mega reflects many investors, maybe not the investors of Zwest, who come in to trade the market on a daily basis. And therefore, we should not overemphasize daily price movements because they may have nothing to do with what the longer term investment outcomes will be for genuine long term investors. So that's point number one. All these short term movements are noise. Uh, if we move on from that to sort of the point that you made in terms about the budget, uh, I would essentially point to two things, Mega. What is it that any economic actor craves for? Whether he's an employee, whether he's an entrepreneur, whether he's a producer, consumer, whatever it might be, a foreign investor. Essentially, the two, three things that they crave for. One is stability in terms of the tax regime. It is very difficult, and particularly so for entrepreneurs, to continuously have to change the way they run their businesses because tax policy is changing every 12 months. So to my mind, really what marked this budget out as something very different from what we've seen in the past is actually that it didn't do anything to the tax structure. And the finance minister and the finance minister's team actually came out and said as much that what they believe will really give value to all the economic participants is the stability in the tax regime. And to some extent, it's also telling that our own investor as behaviors over so many years has been conditioned to see this continuous change in tax policies that kick in every year or every few years. In a sense, there was almost a sense of relief that nothing has changed in the tax policy. Also, of course, that relief was slightly more acute, and this is now purely my opinion. Maybe that contributed to the market's movement that day, because remember, going into the budget, there was a lot of talk about you know all kinds of one-time taxes related to raising revenues for the government. The very fact that there was no one-time tax of any kind on income, capital gains, billionaires, wealth tax, inheritance tax, I think gave a lot of relief to people. And the fact that government came out and stated that it is their belief that they also can play their role in terms of enabling the market and economy and entrepreneurs to do their best by providing a stable tax policy. To my mind, this is really something that hopefully will guide our thought process, not just for this year, but for many years to come. And I think that's where I really find this budget very different in its thought process.
So I think you highlighted two very important points that, in the short term, market is only guided by psychology and, how investors behavior, but long term, it all boils down to fundamentals. And second thing is, the tax stability, which has been a long standing ask of, all investors who wish to come to India. Thank you for highlighting those very two critical points. So my next question is which is union versus state. Now, a question which has gained a lot of prominence is in the last couple of years has been the revenue sharing between center and state. And most of the GST council meetings this year have had this as a major issue. Now, we have seen some tinkering with the taxes and, AIDC coming in, replacing that. While we understand that this is not going to have too much of impact as far as center revenues are concerned, but states would not get its share. So, do you think that this could impact the behavior and spending of states?
So that's a very thoughtful question, Megha. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. The greatest reason why we should feel positive about GST, despite all the various stumbles that have been there in implementation, problems faced by genuine users in terms of dealing with the GST technology and some of the nitty gritty related to the filings, the biggest reason to be optimistic is the fact that the union and the states came together to effectively give away their individual rights of taxation in favor of a collective, which is the GST Council. And I think this is really the greatest story of GST, where the union and the states come together to agree on something in terms of the principles of taxation and how we will move forward. Uh, Unfortunately, when it comes to the issue of sharing of revenues and the actions of both states and the union, uh, the subsequent actions have actually been at cross purposes. I think the states could rightfully submit that the union has relied way too much on raising revenues by way of cess, which does not have to be shared with the states. And that brings about a imbalance in the way certain actions of the union would be interpreted by the states. And of course, in terms of transferring the share of revenues to the states, and also making good the guarantee to the states in terms of the revenues that they would earn, there has been various back and forth, and in a sense there's been some sort of breakdown of the trust. But having said all of that, I still think it's a remarkable decision that we came together to agree to this construct of GST. Very happy to see that in this budget, the finance minister once again tabled the finance commission recommendations and indicated that the government would, go ahead with them, which would guarantee a certain share of revenues to the states. I think the way forward over here, Megha, is eventually to realize that we need to bring all taxes in India within the GST net. Very simplistically, the very fact that excise duty, sales tax, customs duty on the entire bunch of fuels and energy is outside GST is a problem. Because remember, all companies bear the impact of GST, which is embedded in their manufacturing process, because there are taxes on these fuels, but they cannot set it off relative to the GST that is calculated on their end production or the services that they give their customers. Um, and this, I believe, is a serious problem which actually impacts the productivity of businesses. So I would hope that over the next few years, as the revenue buoyancy of GST becomes more and more visible, Government of India would gradually start, along with the GST Council and with the states, look to bring all other remaining items which are outside the GST purview back into GST. And when you do that, and when you then implement the recommendations of the Finance Commission in terms of sharing, then I believe clearly there would be a common objective between the states and the union. So that certainly would have to be the agenda for the GST Council and for the union to demonstrate the leadership and push this agenda over the next few years.
Right, so right. We really hope and pray that getting this all under the same umbrella leads to better capacity utilization, as you rightly pointed out. Now, so my third question is with respect to disinvestment uh, and asset monetization. As far as this budget has laid out, though we understand that the numbers they have proposed is lower than that of last year, but as far as disinvestment is concerned, run a large execution risk. Now, we have factors like finding strategic partners, role of trade unions, terms of deal, etc., to worry about. I wanted to understand from you what are the issues that could become problem areas as far as disinvestment targets are concerned.
Um, I think two parts to this, Mega. We have to give the government some leeway. Obviously, 2021, the financial year, because of COVID, perhaps a lot of the disinvestment plans did not come to fruition. But there's every reason to believe that this year things would be much better. Because remember, in any such large transaction where you're looking for strategic investors to come in and take a stake, they would want to visit the company. They would want to carry out an analysis of the data as provided in the data room that the company was providing them with. They would perhaps want to look at the operations of the company. All of that became constrained over the last year simply because of COVID. So I think it's unfair to be extremely critical about government in terms of execution. The other point that I would make is that even though we use the word disinvestment, to my mind, one of the remarkable changes in the thought process and communication of the entire government, including the finance minister during the budget speech, is that we are now talking privatization. We are not talking merely about disinvestment. What is disinvestment? It is selling shares of public sector companies to the public, but retaining control and majority ownership at 51%. Government of India has moved on from this template to say that we are now willing to privatize enterprises, which means we are willing to go to a zero stake, certainly a less than a majority stake, and whoever is the majority owner of that enterprise, they get to run that enterprise and the government will not stay involved in that company. I think this is a remarkable change in direction. You, Mega, as well as others in this panel may be aware, India did pursue strategic privatization way back during the 1999-2004 government led by Mr. Vajpayee. Unfortunately, there was a series of events, also a Supreme Court decision, which then halted all strategic privatization sometime in 2002 or 2003. So it's actually taken us about 16 or 17 years to get back to this point where last year the government said that we were willing to outright privatize companies like BPCL, companies like Air India, companies like Concor, where of course they will continue to maintain a marginal stake. But I think this is a very big change in thought process. And strategic sales are difficult to pull off for the reasons I mentioned. People will want a lot more access. They will want clear definition of any past liabilities of that organization, including specifically to employees and pensions and all those issues. And they would want a clean slate from the day they take over the company. So by definition, privatization is a lot trickier than disinvestment. But I think the longer term trajectory that government has chosen privatization is something that gives me great comfort. Yes, you're right. It's difficult to execute these things, but I was very happy to hear the economic affairs secretary on television day before, where he was asked for a specific target. He didn't give one, but he specifically mentioned that I hope everybody in the media and everybody else in the markets will continue to engage with us and remind us and push us to achieve these targets during this year. So execution is going to prove challenging. As we've seen with the Farm Bill, there will be, the outcries from the trade unions, perhaps from some consumers, and without doubt, some of the issues related to labor or consumer interests will have to be addressed before privatization. But I hope if all of this is done in a consultative fashion, without losing sight of the fact that we need to move with speed, there's reason to hope that things will look in much better situation. But the important point really, Mega, again want to come back to it, India has now turned a corner in terms of talking the language of privatization as opposed to the language of disinvestment. And in conclusion, keep in mind one thing. Uh, Look at the history of India over the last 10 to 20 years, whether it's Air India, whether it's the PSU banks. Repeatedly, Government of India has had to step forward and provide, 100,000 crores, 50,000 crores by way of bailouts to this organization. Now, I use the word Government of India, but let's be clear, it's you and me who are actually paying for those bailouts, right? As citizens, as taxpayers, we are the ones paying for that. When you privatize these entities, in a way, what you are doing is you are also removing the potential future liabilities that might accrue to Government of India in terms of having to bail out these enterprises once again. So I think that's the other facet we need to keep in mind. In the case of Air India Mega, Government of India may not even receive any money from the new buyer, right? But that's fine. At least Government of India will not have to put in another 100,000 crores to bail it out once again over the next 10 years, as it's done in the previous 10 to 15. So I think that's a strategic mindset change, and it has significant benefits for all of us as taxpayers, that this drain on our money will no longer be there in the future.
So very well said, and we do agree that whatever you have mentioned is absolutely correct, because we have seen companies which were sold at price X and now their EBITDA is more than X, and that has been a change from a public sector enterprise through privatization and efficiency management. So that brings me to the next question, which is somehow linked to what you mentioned in the previous question, which is about philosophical change or the change in the way government speaks about certain things. And this is about G of budget, which is about government borrowing. So one of the things which everyone appreciated about this budget is the transparency. So be it about transparency on moving off balance sheet items to balance sheet, be it about transparency on glide path and not projecting fiscal deficit of next year or next to next year at a very, very optimistic number, but it is a very practical number with some amount of leg space available with the government, and be it about government borrowing also. Now, the concern which all of us have at this point of time, and it has been raised a lot in the media also, is about sovereign rating. So we have not had great experience with our rating for last 13 years, where we have been just one notch above the junk rating. And we have had some initial comments from the rating agencies. But what do you read in terms of India's rating going forward? And is it a big risk that we are facing, or at this point of time, we should be willing to ignore that risk?
I've said this before, Harsh, and I would say it's clearly a calculated risk taken by Government of India, but it's also a calculated risk which we must understand has been taken in a very different global context as compared to the past. Now, unfortunately, India has been a serial underperformer when it comes to achieving any fiscal deficit target whatsoever in the past. Further, we have used slay of hand and accounting tactics to essentially push out expenditure or not record expenditure as part of the fiscal deficit. And that is why, the rating agencies, for their own reasons, have, been cautious about India. But very interestingly, going into this budget, Harsh, in a sense, they've done a very nice jugalbandi with the economic survey and the chief economic advisors actually sort of posing some very tough questions to the credit rating agencies, sort of prepping them in a way and challenging them in a way before you actually present the budget. And in the budget, you do two things. A, you become fully transparent, so you disclose the true extent of the fiscal deficit. See, the 9.5% is not a 9.5% because of expenditure. It's 9.5% for FY21 because they have now taken a lot of the off-balance sheet stuff and put it on the public record. It's the equivalent of what we would call kitchen sinking. Something goes wrong, take all your sins and put them once and for all and say, okay, wash away all these sins today, and from here onwards, I will not commit these sins again. So I think, well done by the government on this front. there is certainly a degree of calculated risk, but I think it is a calculated risk worth taking at this point of time for two reasons. One, the whole global context has changed, right? It has changed because of COVID. It has changed because of the fact that every economy across the world, just a few exceptions, has been forced to respond with tremendous fiscal firepower, right? Now, obviously, the US is a very different economy, but you're talking about fiscal deficits of 15 to 18% every year for 2 years in a row in the US, right? So that's the context in which we need to see the expansion in our deficit to 9.5%, not necessarily just by spending, though that did contribute, but equally by a improvement in the disclosure and the transparency. Will the credit rating agencies react to it negatively? It's hard to say. I can't speak for them, but I think the fact that this is happening globally would put it in different context, right? You'd have to see how much has India's fiscal deficit moved away from the baseline compared to what has happened to other countries across the world, our own emerging market peers as well as developed economies. When you look at it in that context, actually the deterioration is not so bad in my opinion. Because as I said, every country has seen this dramatic shift. It is only when we think about that 6.8 or that 9.5 compared to our past history that we feel uncomfortable. But you have to view that number in the context of what's happening to the fiscal balances of countries across the world. So I think it's a calculated risk. They've taken it. I do think it's a risk that was worth taking. And finally, Harsh, growth, right? Now, eventually, uh, you know, uh, what any lender would worry about, or what a credit rating agency would worry about, is the ability of the borrower to pay back his debt. Is the debt load really sustainable? And the simple and harsh reality over there is that at some level, it is only growth which makes your debt sustainable. You cannot fight your way to debt repayment through austerity beyond a point, right? I mean, you can take off some of the unnecessary expenditure, but you can't crunch your expenditure down to a level where you can make your debt repayment sustainable. So I think implicit in what government has done has been a belief now that we need to go for growth, and it is only the growth outcomes that we get which will allow us to service our debt. And I think this is again something that the credit rating agencies understand. So, fingers crossed, but I do think this time is slightly different.
Very true, sir. And there are two more observations to that. One is about the nature of spending, which I think is very constructive this time. And secondly, people who were condemning government in the month of April, May, June for not giving, fiscal stimulus to India like the way Germany was doing or US was doing, are now the same people who are saying that why fiscal deficit at such a high level. So these are the kind of contradictions which we have to live in our country. So my next question,
So,
which has
Harsh,
been
I'll just add one point over there. I think all of us, and again, all my fingers crossed, we have to admit that there is something that neither of us understands, and we don't know why it has happened. But for whatever set of reasons, the COVID curve in India has behaved in a way where it has allowed us to have the freedom to take certain decisions. Right? We don't know why. Was it because of the lockdown? Was it because Indians were anyway exposed to a much larger number of viruses? We were able to tolerate it. We don't know. But in a way, and I wouldn't call myself an atheist, but I've certainly become a bigger believer in God than I was ever before, because I think it's really the control of this COVID curve which has given the government the flexibility to take some of the decisions that it did today, knowing that with the virus sort of receding, with the promise of a vaccine clearly available, you can take this bet for growth. And as regards disappointments relative to government not announcing something fiscally earlier, actually, we've been saying this for a while that in all our conversations with government, they rightly so said, we need to do something, but let's wait for the more appropriate moment when we can do it. So, full credit to them.
absolutely right, sir. So my next question is partially been answered in the previous question, which is about execution risk, which is E of budget. And here I would bring the word again, which you mentioned, which is growth. Now we all understand as student of finance and economics that if you have growth, you can take care of any problem. And we really hope that this decade belongs to India and we get those kind of growth numbers, which we have been not getting for last good number of years now. But my question is, sir, that are there, risk which we are not anticipating or which we are not seeing at this point of time? It could be commodity pricing, it could be COVID curve too, which could derail us from this path of growth. Do you think that we are fairly comfortable on that path and that should be or given case scenario for us as a base case?
Sure. So Harsh, I would just say that rather than use the word any, growth does not, growth addresses many issues. But to believe that growth addresses all issues would also be unfair. It addresses many, but not each and every issue. So we need to be careful about that. I, when it comes to risks, Harsh, there are two kinds of risks, right? One are what we call the known unknowns, right? The known unknowns are straightforward. If there is any reversal in global liquidity, if for whatever set of reasons particularly the US Fed or other global central banks start to pull back in terms of liquidity unexpectedly. If it happens as growth revives, it's not a problem. But if it happens unexpectedly, it's a potential issue because that will create volatility across the world. Because let's also face it, Harsh, we are in a good spot for the variety of reasons we've covered already. But this has been a global rally, right? Whether you look at developed markets, emerging markets, or even the UK, which is going through a complete mess in terms of the COVID situation, even their market has gone to multi-year highs. It's not at all-time high, but it's doing quite well, thank you, right? Against all expectations. So there is a global liquidity wave, and I think one clear known unknown is the fact that if anything causes this to sort of reverse quite suddenly and unexpectedly, that would create problems for the market. The virus you've already mentioned. I think fingers crossed that's something that remains a risk, but with the visibility of vaccine, and I think there will be some more vaccines coming through soon in India. Hopefully, that is not something that I would lose sleep over too much. Uh, I do think there is one element though that we need to still worry about. One of the challenges, Harsh, is that when we say the economy is recovering, when we are looking at the data, remember all this data has an inherent bias. It is picking up data relating to the organized sector, the formal sector, large business enterprises. We would be fooling ourselves if we believe that this has been an equal recovery. This is an unequal recovery. There are segments of the population in the informal sector, particularly urban services, who are yet to recover from this pandemic. And I do think eventually there will be some more that government will have to do to address these humanitarian issues. We've discussed this with government, and I think one of the challenges is that government does not have a targeting mechanism to figure out who are these people and literally go and hand out money to them. Government of India knows how to figure out who's a farmer, right? And therefore they can put 16,000 rupees into every farm account. But government of India does not know who is a driver in Mumbai, who is a hairdresser in Bangalore, right? Who's that construction worker who moved from his village in Orissa to do construction work in Chennai? These are not known. And therefore, government is not. I do think eventually you will have to do some more targeting to address some of the pain that people in urban services are experiencing. And I think that's another risk that we need to be careful about because, that is something to worry about. The bigger risks, however, and these are the risks which actually matter to market. These are the unknown unknowns, and therefore, by definition, and I've seen this throughout my career. The unknown unknowns. There is no way to know. You just don't know what they are, and it is when they happen that you sort of realize that okay, how much is this going to change my situation as an investor? As a portfolio manager, the way I have always thought about these unknown unknowns, right? What's an unknown unknown? Who the hell knew about COVID before, December of 2019? None of us did, right? So it's a classic unknown unknown. We knew there was some problem in the financial sector in 2007 in the US, but we didn't know it would become the global financial crisis, right? So those are the unknown unknowns. When dealing with the unknown unknowns, over time, we have found that only one thing works. It eventually comes down to the credentials of the companies that you own in your portfolio. How good are they in terms of the cash flow that they generate? How good are they in terms of the return on capital that they generate? And literally, the stronger the balance sheet, the stronger the P&L, more likely that irrespective of whatever challenges are thrown their way, they will be able to navigate it. They will be able to take that pain. And eventually, as you exit the crisis, very often these companies exit with their foot on the accelerator because they were stronger even before they entered the crisis. Whereas the weaker companies actually wither away through a crisis. So in investing, there will always be unknown unknowns. There is no insurance policy available in investing against unknown unknowns, but there is a very simple tool. The quality of the stocks that you put into your portfolio allow you to navigate the crises which are often caused by these unknown unknowns. So, that in a nutshell is the way I look at it.
In fact, this answer was both philosophical on one side and also easily implementable on other side by having stronger companies in our portfolio, which is a very very relevant advice, and that's how market has also been paying premium to those companies for at least a decade now.
Yeah.
So my next question is the last alphabet of budget, which is T, and this is about transformation or transformative policies. So what we saw, though that is not an indicator, is that banking stocks like the budget a lot. And I agree with your first answer that you shouldn't extrapolate the market movement from what the budgetary impacts could be. But one or two key things which were transformative in nature. One is privatization of public sector banks, which we hadn't heard of since the time we were born. And second thing is how the government has come out with the mechanism of ARC, AMC, AIF to transform the bad loans which are there in the system. Now, the question which we have is that what are the pros and cons of this ARC, AMC, AIF structure? And is it more of a sentiment booster, or do you really see this particular approach changing the landscape of banking in India?
So unfortunately, Harsh, at this point of time, we don't have enough information on how the ARC would work and how the AMC would work. So it's very hard to figure out in practical terms, how that's actually going to benefit the sector. But let me put it this way: any growing economy needs a strong set of financial institutions and actually a very good, well-functioning bond market to be able to meet the debt capital requirements of the economy. I think one of the challenges that we have faced in recent years is the large cross section of the banking sector has been plagued with internal issues, which means all the time of the top management is focused on addressing their internal loan loss related issues, non performing loss related issues, rather than looking outside to the market and saying, what's happening in the world? Where is my opportunity to lend to businesses? And how do I grow my lending book? Uh, to my mind, actually, and this has happened not so much because of the budget, ARC or AMC or whatever, but due to a variety of reasons. Today, we are looking at a significant degree of consolidation within the banking sector. There are literally, I would say, 5 or 6 banking institutions which enjoy the confidence of depositors, which have strong capital adequacy ratios, and have demonstrated that they can absorb the credit costs which are thrown their way because of problems in the economy, the losses related to non-performing loans. So to my mind, the situation today is far more conducive towards these banks being able to drive and support the growth of the economy going forward. I think everything that the government does sort of just leads you to a situation where the number of healthy institutions within the system actually goes up. What it also does, and this is not necessarily related uh, uh, in a direct fashion, but just the very fact that government is espousing a pro-growth approach is actually good for banks. Why? Because remember what we discussed earlier, growth does a lot more for the health of the borrower and his or her ability to pay back the lender than anything else. So when you get a budget which is sort of pro-growth, which is sort of willing to leave that fiscal deficit out there for slightly longer than what we anticipated, it's pro-growth, and therefore, by definition, you would hope that the banks benefit in 2 ways. One, because the growth enables their borrowers to pay them back, it improves the financial health of their borrowers. Secondly, it gives them an opportunity for growth because the new requirements which come in for borrowing are also likely to be much more than what we had anticipated earlier. So to my mind, that is what really is, the bigger reason for perhaps why banks did what they did. But really, I think, I speak as myself or even for my team when I say that we genuinely believe that it's this consolidation of the ability to grow and lend in a few institutions, which is what gives us a lot of confidence in the banking sector today. But we can't generalize. It's a handful of banks. It's not every banking institution which finds itself in the same health.
Correct, sir. And that again brings back to the last answer which you had in terms of finding a strong balance sheet, and that is relevant for banks all the more. So from that point of view, I think we can gel both the answers together. So my last question is not about budget because we have covered budget more or less, whatever was relevant for our investor. This is about individual asset allocation of any investor. And we do understand that asset allocations are to be decided basis one's profile and long-term objective. But what we have been hearing, for last few quarters, especially for last one quarter, including your team members, most of the analysts, most of the fund managers are now saying that this could be the growth decade for India. And there are many reasons which are being cited, some of which we discussed also at this point of time. So do you think that when we are in a high probability environment of India being in a good place, does it necessitate any change in the asset allocation? If yes, how should that be done? And if no, even if the times look good, even if the probability of growth is high, still you suggest that we should stay put in the same asset allocation that we have been staying put?
Yeah, okay, that's a very difficult question to answer. And the reason why it's difficult was in your question itself, that, really this is more appropriate to each individual person. But let me try and give some context here. See, eventually, I believe that asset allocation should not be driven by views, right? Because when it comes to views, or when it comes to anything in investing, it's probabilistic, right? So there is a probability that X happens, there is a probability that Y happens, there's also a probability that Z happens, and there's also a probability that something I don't know, which is somewhere between Y and Z, may happen, but I don't even know it can happen, right? So there are many possible outcomes, which is why we believe that sticking to the discipline of asset allocation is more important than anything else. So let's look at what are some bad behaviors. I hear too many people saying, oh my God, market has gone up, COVID, why did it go up? Just sell everything and go home. Point number one, that's a very bad reason, right? Don't do that. Stick to your asset allocation plan, because that is what will eventually guide you through both crisis and opportunity, both, right? Stick to the asset allocation plan. Second point that I would really make on allocation is that eventually it has to have a framework. And any framework, and every investor has to choose his own framework. I think the framework is a function of two things. From an equity perspective, what's the valuation that you're getting? B, what's the opportunity cost available of investing in some other asset class? Here, things are a little bit mixed right now, Harsh, because when I look at equity valuations, it is certainly not, it's not a green flag. It's somewhere between amber and red in terms of when we look at valuations. And I'm not looking at P, because the P is distorted. So I'm ignoring that. I'm looking at a wider set of valuations. It is somewhere in that amber to red territory. So we have to be aware of that. However, it is balanced by the fact that when I look at the returns available in the alternate asset classes, they are also quite depressed at that point of time. So putting this together, I would say just stick to your asset allocation plan. One more point that I would make here, Harsh, and this is really more about valuations. And here I'm talking more experience rather than a template that which you can use, is really to say that when I look at the market again, over the last 28 years that I've been involved, um, it is very normal for the market, because the market is actually a lead indicator in many ways. It actually trades into expensive territory even before the earnings growth starts to come in, right? This happened in 2004. This happened even in 2014, even before we saw a pickup in growth, which lasted about 2 to 3 years subsequently. Right? Remember, 2013 was our worst point in this last decade in terms of growth. So it's very common for market valuations to go up ahead of the earnings recovery coming in. So I would say there is some reason to argue that even though valuations have pushed higher, this may not be a time to jump off the bandwagon, because it is a sign, and there is reason to believe that the economy is entering an upcycle. And if that upcycle lasts, let's say 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, then these valuations can be absorbed by the increase in earnings growth. Remember, Harsh, even when you look at the current year, right, March 21, in March of 20, when we sort of went into the lockdown, the expectation was that March 21 would be a dramatic collapse in earnings, right? Now we have the earnings for June 20, we have earnings for September 20, we are three-fourths of the way through earnings for December 20. Guess what? The earnings for March 21 will end up being a positive year for earnings compared to March 20. Now, who expected that? We certainly didn't expect that. I don't think anybody expected that. And March 22 looks like it will be a strong year for earnings growth again if this incipient recovery continues. And Government of India has done a lot in this budget in terms of its thought process to sort of continue to give us some confidence that that is now likely to get baked in. Now, people sometimes tell me, but for the last 10 years, there were earnings forecasts, but those earnings forecasts did not happen. So analysts are too optimistic. No, that is not the problem. It is just a problem that forecasting is difficult. Remember, uh, just like in the last 7 or 8 years, it would appear that every year analysts overestimated growth. Please go back and look at 2003, 2007. Every year, analysts underestimated the growth because they thought, this growth can't continue. So this is a problem with forecasting, and therefore you need to take that 22 forecast with a pinch of salt. But there is a probability within which that will go right, and that will sort of compensate you for what appear to be rich valuations today. So again, just to conclude, the valuations, look at a more holistic measure. Don't just look at the P. Yes, equities are slightly rich, but I would say stay the course in terms of asset allocation. It is not unusual for equities to become rich in the early stages of an economic cycle, as they did in 2004, as they did in 2014. And that's a good reason for people to hold their asset allocation, stay invested, and continue investing gradually. I think that is eventually the best way to deal with the volatility of equity markets.
Totally agree, sir. And again, this relates to your previous question of unknown unknown. So forecasters also have a limited ability to understand known unknowns, and here we are talking about unknown playing, either for our advantage or for our disadvantage. So that brings us to the end of our discussion, and it was really enriching discussion, and we are sure our investors will find a lot of value in this. Some key takeaway for me as a person or our team is, one of the changes which you have seen in this budget is about the behavior change of the government, which is, changing from disinvestment philosophy to privatization, which could be a huge booster for the government, not only from getting revenue point of view, but also from not accruing cost going forward, be in terms of capital support to those companies, or be it in terms of consuming the bandwidth of the government. A second thing which was very important, where we were not very clear, is about the rating, where you clearly elaborated how it has to be looked in relative perspective and not in absolute perspective. And when you have a situation where you have the worst pandemic of 100 years, you have to be considerate about that. And the one key important behavioral aspect which you mentioned is how we should perceive the market, and we should not be getting tempted by short-term gains or short-term losses, and we should stay the course as far as asset allocation is concerned. And I think you rightly mentioned that asset allocation should not be decided by views, and I would add to that that asset allocation should also not be decided by virus. So it should all be governed by how we see ourselves in our life and what our ability and willingness to take risk is. And one of the most critical observation which I hadn't heard from any analyst or any fund manager for a long period was the inherent biases in terms of how the data is being extrapolated and data is being consumed by all of us. We are looking at corporate earnings of 50, 60, 70, 100 companies, and we are thinking India is out of all kinds of problems. And maybe that is not the case, and we need to be cognizant of the inclusive growth in such a way that even the next door kirana shop owner or a next door bakery is also making similar kind of margins what HUL or Britannia is making. So these were the key learnings for us, and we're really delighted to have you with us, and really appreciate taking out time in such a busy schedule when everyone would be eyeing for your attention on your budget perspective. You could spare out some time. Thank you so much. Wishing you, your family, and entire UTI team a very healthy and prosperous 2021.
Great. Thank you, Harsh. Thank you, Megha. Those were very thoughtful questions, and I hope you, your team, and most importantly, your investors find this conversation today useful. Thank you so much.